In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
It is pretty easy, especially with all the cultural permission to do so, to become pretty self-obsessed and neurotic, to be living somewhere on the spectrum, as they say. With Jesse gone over the last 3.5 weeks, I've become pretty self-absorbed. And the nurse at my doctor's office said, "Isn't this the third time we've seen you this week?" That's my excuse anyhow. But Jesse has returned, and I'm back under adult supervision. So at 6:30 this morning, I decided I better rewrite the sermon I had written. And then the sermon wouldn't transfer to my iPad. I had to change my password on my computer, and now it won't accept any password. So I finally got my sermon to print out, but to save money, Scott has the copy machine locked on two-sided paper. So now I'm flipping pages, which I've never done in 41 years of preaching. So it's a bit of a mess. But I thought actually we might want to figure out, where do we fall? Where do we fall in our neurosis, our neurotic individualism? And this is exactly the right place to do this. As our epistle says, the Word of God is living and active, discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. In other words, God's working really deep down in our hearts, and when we go there, we meet him and receive his grace and mercy. So as we draw near to the throne of grace in worship, it is here we are most able, with God's insightful, piercing word of reality, to turn the page, I'm jumping here, develop a realistic self-assessment of ourselves, to evaluate where we might fall on the continuum. And whether we want to get over our self-obsessions or just get over our self-inflated selves, the prescription for that is exactly the same. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Now, I've sort of set this up to be rather individualistic and therapeutic, but the gospel message is not individualistic at all. The object of Jesus' teaching here is actually directed at the church. Not its individual members, separate and alone, but members of the church as a gathered community. Mark's gospel uses the disciples as illustrations of how the church should confront the challenges it will face, how the church should live the life God intends for it to have. And the two major challenges that confronted them then continue to confront us today. Firstly, then and today, Jesus is often reduced to a miracle worker whose purpose is to miraculously fulfill our individualistic and self-glorifying desires, instead of Jesus as the Son of God who came to restore man to God. And secondly, Mark is making clear the persecution and sacrifice we can expect, and not the prosperity preachers of a false gospel will often sell. And the sad thing about that false gospel is, rather than leading into the place where we need God and he is there for us and we come to know him, rather instead, that false gospel serves to lead us to the loss of our souls in a material world. We are always purposefully careful at St. George's to present only the historic faith of the church. So our ears are always alert for the popular and self-glorifying gospel that sells happiness rather than revealing the truth, that promises peace without the warning of suffering. And the most glaring warning siren of this false gospel is an individually directed self-improvement message, an individualization of the gospel that is aligned with the culture of radical individualism, with only symbolic thought of others, with a painless and thus meaningless sacrifice being offered. Our individual well-being rather than the furtherance of the kingdom always at the center. The goal and work of this sort of message is not life with God as God intended, but life looking more like something New York advertising agents would imagine life should be, seducing us into believing that is the life for us. There is a disturbingly demonic commercial airing right now that connects an external material success and personal distinction with the devil's theft and destruction of our souls. It is the accurate commercial for the new RDX SUV that uses a song that not even the Rolling Stones will sing anymore, but they originally introduced in the 60s. And see if these words aren't familiar hearing the ad. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste, as this RDX comes into the spotlight. But it continues. I've been around for a long, long year, stole many a man's soul to waste. The song continues to clarify itself. And I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain, made darn sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his faith. The song title is Sympathy for the Devil. Why would we allow ourselves to be seduced into buying a car by the image of being a person of wealth and taste when it is the means for the devil's theft of our souls to waste? I'll tell you why, because their marketing research shows that that's exactly what will seduce us into buying a car. That we might be this grandiose character of wealth and taste. Now, I've got to say, because the last service there were plenty of people who owned this car, that I will describe something of how that works. So my Jeep has almost 200,000 miles on it, and as a pastor, I really ought to buy a minivan with 3 rows so I can schlep parishioners around to different things and make it easy for the elderly to get in. But I cannot, for the life of me, envision myself pulling into the mud parking lot at Abe Basin in anything less than a 4-wheel drive with big tires. And so we do succumb to this kind of thing, don't we? But this commercial is so gross in literally saying that by buying this car, you can make friends with the devil. And it is not only with cars. Many churches and evangelists are doing the same. They proclaim a gospel directed individually. That proclaim a gospel directed individually, when in fact Jesus was addressing the community. Jesus' miracles were for a witness that God was among them as a people, not just a problem solver, one event based on individual needs at a time. The message Jesus spoke in this morning's gospel is a warning about threats against the community, necessitating a response by the whole community, and yet within the context of the community being the very place where the individual members experience the healing balm of faith. If we are to be the church of the gospel, if we are to be the people of God, we must be clear that community is the context for our work. That community charts out the life we are to have, and community the experience we can expect. In short, we are all to be servants with all that that would entail. Fundamentally, what this means is that the purpose of the church is not that its members are here to be serviced, but that we together are a community of servers. A church in which to pool our energy and resources to the church to which we belong, to serve the Lord's missionary purposes. The church is its members together for the world, and we don't stand very tall apart from one another. This doesn't mean we don't offer pastoral care to our members, but the pastoral care is a secondary organizational concern. And let me put that in a little bit perspective, because my whole life has been about pastoral concern. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about parishioners. The interesting thing about that is when I send out that spiritual signal that I'm thinking about somebody, sure enough, they'll be in church on Sunday morning. Which means that last night, in the middle of the night, I probably thought of everybody who's here, because you're here today. That's how I'd add that up. I want to say that because when I say pastoral care is secondary, first is living as witnesses and workers of the gospel. So if we put all that emphasis on pastoral care, obviously we have a lot of energy and thought and concern and focus on being workers for the gospel. We do take care of the wounded, our fallen, but our focus is on leading all God's people back to Him, where true peace and ultimate healing in God is to be found. In a marketing-driven church, the focus is on cultivating and affirming members. In a biblically envisioned church, telling the truth about Jesus to bring others into our fold is our goal. And what that looks like is a resolve as a community in the face of the cultural opposition, the work of the devil, accomplished in a posture of being servants of all, in which each of us as members fully participate. And in that way, our servant spirit finding its eternal meaning. Importantly, it involves literally everything we do. Worship that is historic, consistent, and uplifting, that articulates rightly, informs us firmly, made easily accessible for those coming from outside, with the purpose of drawing others into the worship and life of God. So too in our financial participation, in our giving to the church, it is not for services rendered. This is really a problem in the church. So many people feel like they're paying for services rendered. There's somebody I visit who, if I don't make it every 4 weeks, gives the check they were going to give me to the church to the Salvation Army. And I said, well, I can no longer accept that because it looks like paying for communion. See, we don't do that. We had a reformation about that sort of thing. But our giving to the church is not for services rendered, but to support our community ministry beyond ourselves. When we are writing sermons, it is not to therapeutically engage our parishioners, but to make our parishioners and our visitors into believers. By taking up our cross and following Jesus, we become a servant community, and not just a church where we come to be soothed. Contrary to pop Christianity practiced in many churches today, everything about the fellowship of the early church directed individuals to be part of a witnessing whole. In a real sense, this is about losing your life to save it, because it is in this dramatic and profound way that we defeat the devil's plan to separate and waste our souls. This happens we are redeemed, restored, reclaimed, really, when our energies and our resources are dedicated to just this godly purpose, when our gospel is about taking up our cross and serving. And it doesn't happen until that happens. Our church is the church God is calling us to be, when it is not for us, but we are for it. That's the church God is calling us to be. Not a church that is for us, but we are for the church. Only when we get this straight, by reordering our commitments and time, will we see ourselves not as a people of wealth and taste, but a people who are servants for the kingdom. As our church then flourishes in God's purpose for it, so too will we each individually glory in God's meaning and purpose and direction for our own lives. It is in a healthy and servant parish with ministry and mission directed beyond ourselves, where the focus of old members is on new members, that old and new alike find the peace and life of God. This bringing us to the point that Robert suggested last week. Have you gotten the drift that this is somewhat of a stewardship sermon? Maybe a little bit. But this is the time of year we talk about money, and it is important to do so that we don't end up like the rich young ruler in last week's gospel, who went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. Who was a man of wealth and taste, and he was ripe for the devil's destruction, and he caved. So we talk about the sacrament of financial giving because money is a direct link to our hearts and souls as we become slaves instead of owners, directing our efforts and our generosity toward those out there who we don't even yet know, and thereby discovering in this way God's true blessings for us more than anything we can otherwise obtain. What we call our own need as givers to give. So our community vision is about just this sort of ministry and mission. And of course, we certainly want to continue all the work we're currently doing, worshiping, educating, caring, feeding the poor, protecting the unborn, sheltering orphans. But we also want to increase our ministry of informing, inspiring, and forming. Our goal this year involves two major projects. The first project, which we've already planned out and engaged, is hiring full-time Professor Dave Paris to lead a purposeful program of biblical education within the parish and support of clergy in the larger church to proclaim rightly the faith as it has been historically received and understood. Clergy are both pressed for time and easily led astray, and our ministry with Dave is to help everybody know the gospel and proclaim the gospel. Secondly, and this will begin this next summer, to hire a fully formed and seasoned priest, not a brand new, fresh out of seminary priest, but a fully formed and seasoned priest to share in bringing into being the biblical ideal of a servant church, and to develop a model for both clergy and laity to know full well whose they are and as servants what God intends for them to do. That's the focus of our stewardship, to add these two full-time positions to our staff, to be a church for others, to be a church that's not self-involved, but other-involved. And we will offer the means in the coming weeks to commit both our energy and our resources to be part of this godly community, not about ourselves, but about God's work of restoration in the world, and together to take up our collective crosses and follow Jesus together. Amen.